Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribe Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are all on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T. And our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore President Nixon and Watergate with our distinguished guests this evening. I am now honored to introduce tonight's speakers. I am delighted to extend a warm virtual welcome back to the library to Michael Dobbs. A longtime reporter for the Washington Post, he covered the collapse of communism as a foreign correspondent. He has also taught at leading American universities, including Princeton, the University of Michigan, and Georgetown. His previous books include the best-selling 1 Minute to Midnight on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was part of an acclaimed Cold War trilogy. His most recent book is King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, an American Tragedy. I'm also so pleased to welcome our moderator for this evening's discussion back to the library virtually. Evan Thomas is a best-selling author of 10 books. He was a writer, correspondent, and editor for 33 years at Time and Newsweek, including 10 years as Washington bureau chief at Newsweek, where at the time of his retirement in 2010, he was editor at large. He wrote more than 100 cover stories and in 1999 won a National Magazine Award. He has appeared on many TV and radio talk shows and has taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton. Please join me in welcoming our special guest tonight. Over to you, Evan.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm happy to be back at the Kennedy Library and to be talking about this wonderful book. There are a lot of books written about Richard Nixon. I think something like 14 biographies, including my own, and this one is the best. It's the most vivid. It's the best way to learn about Nixon, who was an endlessly fascinating guy. I should say at the outset, you should buy the book. There's a link to it on the website, and so I hope you do. Michael, since this is the Kennedy Library, talk to us first about whether Nixon's, or the degree to which Nixon's envy and resentment about John F. Kennedy led him to Watergate.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to the Kennedy Library for inviting me and for you to agreeing to talk with me. You've written one of the best books about Nixon, and so I feel as though I've been welcomed into this fraternity of Nixon biographers, even though actually I've only chosen to write a slice of Nixon's life, not the entire life, as you and others have tackled. But the question of Nixon's rivalry with JFK, Jack Kennedy, is a very interesting one. I think they joined Congress on exactly the same day, so they were very similar ages. And in the 50s, they were quite friendly with each other, although they came from different political traditions, different parties. But certainly from Nixon's side, the friendship was mingled with resentment. They came from completely different backgrounds, of course. I mean, Kennedy came from this incredibly wealthy East Coast family. He had, in Nixon's view at least, everything handed to him on a plate. And Nixon was born to a dirt poor family, farmer's family out in California, a much less prosperous California than today. And everything Nixon achieved in life, he had to do through his own efforts. He didn't have a rich father to bankroll his start in politics. So, Nixon always considered him the outsider, and he was the outsider compared to Kennedy. I think on your question specifically about what led to Watergate, well, I just mentioned the 1960 election. And the 1960 election was a lot closer than the last election. And Nixon certainly had valid reasons to contest the results in Illinois and Texas. And he could have fought that election, but he decided he was unhappy about the result. He thought that he'd been screwed by the Kennedys and their supporters, but he accepted the result of the election. But on the other hand, it sort of fed his resentment against the Kennedys. And it increased his determination not to be outdone and cheated by them ever again. And I think that explains in part his thirst for political intelligence and his willingness to resort to, what were then called dirty tricks, or, what actually were illegal criminal activities, to make sure that he was never going to lose an election. I mean, actually the 72 election wasn't, of course, to the Kennedys, but it was the same mentality as far as Nixon's concerned. So that's certainly part of the background to Watergate, and explains Nixon's thirst for intelligence, and also his sense that, the Kennedys were doing this to him, so why shouldn't he do the same thing to the Kennedys and people like them?
So were the Kennedys doing this to him? Was he the victim of dirty tricks?
I think, not to the extent that he imagined it. I mean, there's one particular incident, for example, which he talks about over and over again. He claims that his campaign plane in 1960 was bugged by the FBI. There's something to that story, but his campaign plane was never bugged, and Agnew's campaign plane wasn't bugged. But the FBI was following people and listening into people who were close to Nixon. I mean, you could argue with good reason, actually, because one of them was a woman who was trying to advise Nixon on Vietnam. So there was some sort of tracking of Nixon, not to the extent that he imagined, but he kind of inflated this in his own mind. Actually, J. Edgar Hoover had told him that the Kennedy people had bugged his campaign plane. So he had some reason to believe it, but it turned out that story was exaggerated.
Well, that wasn't the Kennedy people bugging his campaign. That was the Johnson people bugging his campaign, right? I mean, the Kennedys.
Yeah, right.
1960.
Yeah, it wasn't the Kennedy people. That was the Johnson people. But in his mind, he
It's all one.
sort of
It's all one
complaints
big
everybody
wow.
together. Right.
Yeah.
It's the same people who are out to do him in somehow.
I think his beef in 1960 was that Kennedy stole the election, that Mayor Daley, but Kennedy stole the election, right? And that the Kennedys had dirty tricksters. It was never clear to me whether I think it's still unclear. History is still unclear the degree to which the Kennedys really did do dirty tricks against him. I think that's still an unresolved issue.
Right. I didn't investigate the 1960 election, I must say. So I'm looking at it more through Nixon's own prism. But in terms of Nixon's psychology and mentality, it's certainly, he felt that he'd been robbed. And then, of course, he lost the California election. I mean, the paradox of Watergate is actually that he didn't need to gather all this intelligence in 1972, because in 1972, he won one of the most convincing landslides in American history, by some extent, by some measures, the biggest landslide ever in American history. But he was still operating on the principle that his enemies were out to get him, and he had to get them first. That was the way he thought.
Did Nixon order the break-in at the Watergate?
There's no evidence that he did, or he even knew about the break-in of the Watergate, but he'd certainly ordered other break-ins, including some that never took place. I mean, there was one into the Brookings Institution, a well-known case. When I'm asked about this, I think it's rather like the English story history of Henry II and his Archbishop Thomas à Becket, who was murdered by the Knights of the King. It was a famous episode in English medieval history. And the king said to his knights, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And they took that as an instruction to go out and murder the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so it was a little like that with Nixon. He didn't actually issue orders for many of these crimes, but he signaled that his aides had a green light to do whatever was required. So, in a presidency and the White House, it's a kind of machine for fulfilling the wishes of the president. And aides are competing against each other to fulfill the president's wishes, whether or not he issues an explicit order. And it was a bit like that with the genesis of Watergate. So I don't think he knew about the break in advance, although he had encouraged similar dirty tricks, and he was certainly involved in the cover-up once in the months after the break-in.
You set this up as a tragedy, explicitly structured as a tragedy in 4 parts, like a classical Greek tragedy. And one of the things about tragedy, I know there are different definitions of it, but one of the things about tragedies is there's an inevitability about them, that the hero kind of knows that they're fated and they do it anyways. To what extent does that apply to Nixon? To what extent was this inevitable? And to what extent did he sort of foresee his own demise?
Well, I don't think it was inevitable. I don't think history and politics are inevitable, and one can identify, various key turning points where it could have turned out differently. I don't think his resignation was inevitable. But there was certainly something in his character that I've referred to already, this kind of determination to fight even after you don't have to fight anymore. And the kind of burning sense of resentment and his hatred of his enemies. Actually, there's a Nixon quote that when his last day in office, he gathers his staff and he tells them, "Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." And so this is really the Achilles heel of Richard Nixon. He was he had outsized qualities in many respects, great qualities, but he was also an outsized hater. And he allowed these hatreds to eventually destroy him and to destroy his presidency.
He's a little late to realize that point. I mean, it always struck me that he says that as he's going out the door. It's a little late for him to realize that hating your enemies is going to destroy you. And it does raise this kind of interesting question. How self-aware do you think Richard Nixon was? How much do we know that he knew about himself?
I think he was quite self-aware. I think, of course, anybody who, makes it all the way to the presidency and the White House is isolated to a certain extent, and they're surrounded by yes men and aides who are trying to, do whatever they think their boss wants. And so you need a very firm grounding in order to, still be a rational person in that environment. I mean, Nixon did have his family and, particularly his daughter, Julie, and his wife, who, I think grounded Nixon. But then, he also had this other side in which he would sort of go off on tirades and tantrums. And, some of the times he didn't mean his orders to be fulfilled. Actually, there are 2 different types of aid to Nixon. There's one, like a typical example, the best example probably is Chuck Colson, Nixon's so-called hatchet man, who believed that he had to fulfill, every single one of Nixon's wishes, even the very minor ones, the trivial ones. And Nixon loved him for that. but there were others who thought they were a barrier, or should be a barrier, between Nixon and his dark side. And to a certain extent, Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff, was that. I mean, Nixon would issue an order to bomb someone or to bomb some country, and they would not carry it out immediately, or to fire someone. And every day he's saying, fire this person, fire that person, don't talk to Time magazine, don't talk to this other newspaper. And then, they cool down, they procrastinate, and the next day he's in a better mood and he's forgotten all about it.
Haldeman is a particularly interesting character because he's his chief of staff. He is the gatekeeper. In many ways, he's a good chief of staff in the sense of making the trains run on time and having a good paper trail and orderly and pretty smart. And as I think about it, I mean, he has a sense of humor about his own boss. You've read Haldeman's diaries, where he's kind of mordant about Nixon and kind of has a good sense of humor about it. And as you said, Haldeman would say no on a pretty regular, almost a daily basis. He would say no. And yet it happens. Watergate happens. I mean, the system breaks down. And I'm intrigued by this. I would like to get your view on why Haldeman, who was this pretty good chief of staff in so many ways, did say no to Richard Nixon many times. Why did Watergate happen nonetheless?
Right. Well, Nixon, as you said, he was the archetype of the modern chief of staff. He invented the position of chief of staff. Actually, I don't think he was called chief of staff, but in effect, he was the first modern day chief of staff with his hands all over the paperwork. And he invented this system of everything having to go through him. He and another aide, John Ehrlichman, were called the Berlin Wall, because they were the two people around Nixon who controlled his dealings with everybody else. So that's true. Haldeman controlled everything. I mean, I think this system invented by Haldeman broke down when it came to the dirty tricks and the illegal actions, because in those cases, issues were never issued explicitly. There was no paper trail for Watergate. There was it's all sort of wink and the nod and fulfilling the president's wishes. And also there were other people with back channels to Nixon. But Nixon had an office, not only in the Oval Office, but he had an office across the alleyway. It's called the Executive Office Building. Next to him, Haldeman was in the West Wing in the White House, but next to Nixon, sitting next to his hideaway in the Executive Office Building, was Chuck Colson. So Chuck Colson could go in anytime Nixon summoned him and get up to all sorts of things that Haldeman, for all his attempts to control everything, was only sort of, dimly aware of. So this system broke down when it came to the illegal actions. That was the flaw in the system.
Well, one flaw in the system was that they hired Liddy and Hunt, who have to be two of the great clowns of all time. That for a White House who thought it was well run and had the A team in there, how did they hire those guys? I mean, how did that even happen?
Well, this is the gang that couldn't shoot straight. And that kind of illustrates the point that I was making, was that, when after the leak of the Pentagon Papers, the secret Vietnam War history, Nixon got cranked up by Henry Kissinger, among other people, to do something about all these leaks. So he issued orders, they had to crack down on the leaking. So then they had to find people to stop the leaks, and they called them the plumbers. And Chuck Colson went out and found Hunt, the man who turned out to be in charge of the plumbers, who was an old, he had also been to Brown University and he'd been at the CIA. So he was recruited through this old boy network. And he turned out to be a complete flake and sort of had all sorts of wild ideas. And then he recruited Liddy. And as you say, Liddy is a very interesting character, but it says a lot about an administration and a presidency that trusted this wild man to run anything. And Liddy was sort of wound up, transferred over to the Committee to Re-elect the President, the so-called CREEP organization, and was just sort of bankrolled, told to gather political intelligence, and he came up with this wild scheme to break into the Watergate. Actually, they pulled him back on various even wilder schemes. But that was set in motion and nobody was really in charge of it. Which goes back to the earlier point that Haldeman said, Nixon didn't order Watergate, but he certainly caused Watergate. And he caused it by this very dysfunctional sort of system that he had, which was, half the White House was exceptionally well run and it was under Haldeman's firm control. And then there was another group that was not really under control of anyone, including Hunt, Liddy, and various other dirty tricksters.
So when there's the break into the White House, to the Watergate, and they get caught, this is June 1972. Mm-hmm. It's 2 years before he left, so it's before the election. Why didn't Nixon just say, now you have criminal activity, and they've been caught, and they've been traced to the White House. Why didn't Nixon or Haldeman, somebody, say, okay, purge these guys, get to the bottom of it. We're ahead in the poll. I think he was ahead in the polls by about 30 points. Mm-hmm. So he was going to beat McGovern unless he ran naked down Pennsylvania Avenue. Why didn't Nixon and Haldeman step up to it right away and kill this thing before it multiplied?
Right. Well, obviously that's what they should have done. And Nixon, with hindsight, was sufficiently self-aware to understand that. And he keeps on telling them, his aides at various points, it's not the crime that is the problem, it's the cover-up. And he had come to that understanding because he pursued a spy called Alger Hiss. Early on, it had been the making of his career as a politician. And he had shown that, Hiss had been lying to Congress. And so he understood, the perils of covering up. But they were in a specific political context. I mean, the Watergate occurred in June of 1972. That's about 4 or 5 months before a presidential election. So they're in a campaign year, and they start thinking, well, we can't do anything before that might jeopardize the boss's re-election. We'll postpone that till after his re-election. And so they put it on the back burner, and actually they succeed. I mean, the cover-up did succeed for those first few months. Nixon was re-elected in a landslide. There were some lonely reporters, including Woodward and Bernstein at the Washington Post, who were pursuing it, but it wasn't really going anywhere until the period that I describe in my book, which is the period after Nixon's second inaugural in 1973, when the whole thing begins to unravel. And that's the period that really interested me, this unraveling of the conspiracy, the unraveling of the presidency, and the personal existential crisis, faced by the president. What does he do about this?
So let's talk about that a little bit. So you set the scene. He's just won by this incredible landslide. Mm-hmm. I guess it was his largest or second largest, maybe in history, popular vote. Is he happy about it? How does Nixon feel in January 1973? What's his mood?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting about the election. After he won this thumping landslide, he went into a bit of a depression. I mean, Nixon always thrived on crisis, on fighting back, on being the underdog. So he won this landslide and he didn't quite know what to do with it. And he retreats to Camp David for weeks at a time. And he goes into a bit of a depression. But then when my book starts, which is the eve of his second inaugural, he's plotting with Colson how he's going to, get even with all his enemies, including the Washington Post, how he's going to drive the Washington Post share price down. He thinks they've put Watergate behind him. So he's feeling pretty good. He's at the top of his game. Watergate seems to be certainly on the back burner. It's not completely forgotten. But, then within a few days, by the way, he's also in the background of all this is the Vietnam War. And he's negotiating an end to the Vietnam War, or an end to American involvement in the Vietnam War, a peace agreement with the North, which also comes through a couple of days after his second inaugural. So Kissinger, who is the arch flatterer, says, you won 3 for 3, Mr. President. You won opening to China, you won détente with Russia, and now you've wound up this war that was started by your predecessors. So he's feeling, pretty much at the top of his game in January 1973, and over the next 3 months, 100 days actually, it all unravels. And by the end of that, he's forced to fire or accept the resignations of his 2 closest aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and he himself is thinking, I might not be able to finish my presidential term. Perhaps I should resign myself.
So he's feeling good there on the eve of his second inaugural. When does he start to feel the ice cracking under him? What happens that makes him realize that he's got trouble?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the conspiracy begins to unravel, and that's sort of one of the things I find, or the cover-up begins to unravel. And I try to describe that process. It's like a kind of, dominoes collapsing. One domino collapses, then the next domino collapses, and finally they all collapse. And the first domino that collapses is a man called James McCord, who was part of the break-in team. And he's worked at the CIA. He's very unhappy that the CIA is being blamed for this or is being dragged into it. And he's also unhappy. He's sitting there in the courtroom and he hears he hears his boss, a man called Jeb Magruder, the deputy director of CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, commit perjury on the witness stand, saying that he had absolutely nothing to do with it. And this is all the initiative of people lower down, including Liddy and Hunt and James McCord. And McCord understands he knows that is not truth, that is a lie, that Magruder has committed perjury. So he's thinking, why should I go to jail? Why should I spend 10, 15 years in jail? And this guy, Jeb Magruder, gets off, still is, has a happy family life. He's well considered. He has a good reputation. I'm not going to put up with it. So McCord goes to the trial judge, John Sharika, and says that perjury has been committed in this trial. And that is the first domino that begins to unravel this whole conspiracy, because once McCord has blown the whistle on people in the White House, then other people, including most famously John Dean, begin to think, well, we better save ourselves as well. And they all start, well, the phrase that Nixon uses, they all start pissing on each other, and eventually they start pissing on the president. And that's Nixon's phrase. So
is John Dean a hero, a villain? What do we make of John Dean's role in all this?
Well, I think a lot of characters in this story are neither heroes nor villains. They're a mixture of the two. That's what makes them interesting. And for example, another example is Deep Throat, the deputy director of the FBI, Mark Felt, who was leaking to Bob Woodward and other reporters. There's always a mixture, often with whistleblowers, there's a mixture of motivations, part noble and part self-interested. And that's certainly the case, I think, with John Dean, that, John Dean had been the he described himself as the desk officer of the cover-up. So he'd been in charge of the cover-up for 7 or 8 months. And then suddenly he goes to the prosecutors and starts telling them the whole story. I mean, he'd been leading it for 7 months. So and the moment when he starts to tell his story to the prosecutors is when he himself understands, earlier than the rest of the Nixon aides, that he is in mortal jeopardy himself and risks being sent to prison. So, you know, there's a kind of mixture of motivations in Dean and a lot of other people.
What did Nixon and Haldeman think of Dean?
Well, initially they think Dean is a wonderful guy because he's sort of working for them. He's put the lid on the Watergate scandal. He's sort of juggling all these weird characters. He's getting them to all shut up. He's paying hush money or authorizing hush money to be paid to the burglars. So they think Dean is the answer to all their prayers and is incredibly efficient. They're kind of amused by his sort of jet set persona, his beautiful wife. And then it takes them a long time to figure out what Dean is up to, actually. I mean, even after Dean has started talking to the prosecutors, Dean is playing this kind of double game. And he's talking to the prosecutors by night and acting the loyal Nixon aide by day. And, you know, that's a very interesting dynamic. I mean, when they realize what he's up to, then it's pretty much too late, because then they actually, Chuck Colson, I think, says, well, you've got a viper in your bosom. There are all these marvelous Watergate quotes, but he refers to Dean as a viper in your bosom, which he has to hold tight to his bosom, otherwise the viper will sting him. So they had this problem with Dean, even though when they realized what he was up to, they didn't want to cut him loose completely because that would make him even more dangerous than he was before.
There's a great scene. You get a lot of mileage out of the tapes, of course. I mean, what was it? Wonderfully, the tapes are incredibly vivid, and you couldn't make them up. There's a great scene where Haldeman and Nixon are chortling about Dean's great sex life. And meanwhile, you cut away, Dean is miserable. He's drinking a quart of scotch every night and he's not sleeping with his wife at all. And it's just this two-screen thing you've got going there that runs all through this narrative of people underestimating each other. Again, you can't make it up.
Well, if I could just break in here, I'm glad you mentioned the tapes, because, you know, probably your method too as a historian is you're to a certain extent trying to, you're telling history, you're applying the techniques of fiction to nonfiction and to history. So you're trying to create scenes. And you're trying to use a lot of dialogue, you know, like novelists introduce a lot of dialogue in their books. And this is the richest source of authentic dialogue that I can think of, where you don't have to make anything up. It's all there. And in fact, some of these lines would be impossible to invent, including the line about John Dean's sex life and the viper in the bosom and so on and so forth. I mean, some of the famous Watergate lines are sort of well known at the time, but there are many more that are kind of fun and interesting and revealing that come directly from the tapes.
Why did Nixon tape himself?
Sorry?
Why did Nixon tape himself?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, previous presidents had taped themselves. John F. Kennedy taped himself, and so did Lyndon Johnson. The difference between them and Nixon was that Nixon was a bit of a klutz, and nobody, including himself, trusted him to turn the machines on and off. So Nixon, they decided to install these machines that turn themselves on automatically. But and that created a huge amount of, you know, everything was taped, and not just one room in the White House, not just the telephone conversations, but what was happening in Camp David, everywhere else. Okay, to answer your question about why he did this, Initially, he had had Johnson's taping system torn out of the White House. He didn't want to tape himself. But then he started thinking, well, I want to write my memoirs, and I want, history to, it was a bit like Winston Churchill, history will judge me kindly because I'll write it myself. And he wanted a record. And he was also, rivals to some extent with Henry Kissinger. He knew that Henry Kissinger was keeping very detailed notes of their conversation. And Nixon wanted his own very authoritative record that only he would control. I mean, he never imagined that these tapes would become public property. And he imagined that, he would squirrel them away and refer to them when, in his retirement, and use them for writing his memoirs, and perhaps use some of them for getting even with people. And he was horrified, of course, when he finally understood very, very late in the game that there was a risk of the tapes becoming public.
Why didn't he burn the tapes?
Yeah, but that's an interesting question. The tapes, existence of the tapes was revealed by a man called Alexander Butterfield, who had been in charge of putting them in. And Butterfield was hauled before Congress, and he was asked a direct question, and he thought he had to reply truthfully. So he said, yes, there is a taping system in the White House. And at that point, Nixon had, he just come down with a very severe bout of pneumonia and had been taken to the US Naval Hospital here in Bethesda, actually, where I live, the same place that Trump was taken to with COVID. And he was in very poor shape. And he was wondering what to do about the tapes. And some of his aides were telling them that he should burn the tapes, organize a bonfire. And others were saying, that would create such a huge scandal that, and besides, some of these tapes can be useful to you, and they'll never get them anyway because the tapes were always considered private property of a president. And Nixon decided overnight, he wasn't thinking clearly, and he almost immediately regretted it, but he decided not to burn the tapes, to keep them. And there was something, in the back of his mind, he thought that he could use these tapes against John Dean and others, selectively, of course. And he, didn't foresee that it would go all the way to the Supreme Court, and ultimately he would be forced to give up control of the tapes. That didn't occur to him at that point.
Do you think he should have burned the tapes?
Well, from his point of view, obviously. I mean, I think the tapes sealed his fate. I didn't think he would have been forced to resign as president had it not been for those tapes, because you then had a he said, she said, prior to the tapes coming out, you had a sort of he said, she said rival accounts. The president was saying one thing, his accusers, most notably Dean, was saying another, and it was only the tapes that actually settled that question. I don't think there would have been sufficient evidence to force Nixon out of office without the tapes. So from his point of view, it was a mistake not to destroy the tapes. I mean, you're asking me as a historian, yeah, I think it's wonderful that the tapes were kept. Absolutely incredible resource that no other president is ever going to record himself the way Nixon did, possibly never record themselves at all because they saw what happened to Nixon. So we have this absolutely unique resource for one president that is never going to be repeated.
It wasn't just certainly the evidence, the smoking gun tape did sink him, but it was also the crudeness of the tapes. I mean, Nixon's, not just that he swore, but this whole manner that comes out. He must not have been aware of what he sounded like.
Well, I mean, to be fair to him, these were private conversations that he thought, he never, there's a difference between his private conversations with his cronies like Haldeman and others and Colson, and the way he talked in public, of course. And, Nixon was a bit cruder in his language than other presidents, but other presidents have certainly sworn. I think, LBJ was probably just as crude as Johnson. I mean, it's true that there are sort of, there's there are anti-Semitic remarks, there are anti-Black remarks. I must say Nixon's a bit of an equal opportunity hater because he had numerous enemies, and he sort of uses colorful, sometimes very offensive language about many of them. But, if you were taped at home or I was taped, or many of us, I'm sure there would be things that many of us would be embarrassed about. So it's kind of very raw. This is very, very raw stuff. And, I shudder to think I don't think I rival Nixon, but I'm certainly said some things that I would be ashamed about if they became public.
Yeah. How did Henry Kissinger avoid getting tangled up in this web? I mean, certainly obviously didn't go to jail, but he pretty much ducked a bullet. How did he avoid trouble?
Yeah, and the Nixon-Kissinger relationship is very interesting. Basically, Kissinger is the arch flatterer, and Kissinger is useful to Nixon, but Nixon is also jealous of Kissinger's, success with the media, and he thinks Kissinger is getting far too much credit for various foreign policy achievements that should rightly go to Nixon himself. But on the question of how Kissinger, he wasn't involved in Watergate. He was involved. There are lots of, crimes possibly that you could accuse Kissinger of, including the bombing of Cambodia, but that doesn't go to the heart of Watergate. So Kissinger, had kept himself pretty separate from, all the criminal activities which were mainly involved in domestic politics. He was certainly, he was also very diligent about tending to his, media relations. And actually there's sort of amusing moments on the tapes where Kissinger is assuring Nixon that he doesn't talk to any of those horrid journalists. And then a few moments later, you can find out from the Kissinger transcripts that he's phoning up all the journalists that, Nixon despises and detests, and, rattling on his boss. So, yeah, Kissinger certainly played a double game.
I have to say, I felt a little sorry for Nixon with Kissinger's involvement. Kissinger was very tight with our old employer, Mrs. Graham. And of course, Nixon knew that. Here, his arch enemy, the Washington Post, is out to get him, Woodward Bernstein, the paper itself, and Mrs. Graham. And Haldeman is having dinner twice a week with Mrs. Graham. And I could see how that would get under Nixon's skin. Haldeman, Kissinger was, shall we say, not the most loyal person in this, at least in this context. How much do you think that aided Nixon? How much do you think that aided Nixon that Kissinger was selling him out? How much of a factor was that?
Right. I think that Nixon was certainly resentful of that. And, he pretty much knew what Kissinger's game was. Actually, Kissinger he found Kissinger very helpful and useful to him, because Kissinger was a sort of master diplomatic negotiator, and he certainly performed a useful function for Nixon. Probably Nixon would have gotten rid of Kissinger in the second term had it not been for Watergate. In fact, we have evidence to that effect, saying Henry will have to go. So it's really Watergate that saves Kissinger in the second term. There are moments in the tapes when, on the one hand, Kissinger is useful to Nixon. Nixon enjoys Kissinger as an intellectual sparring partner. They're both incredibly well read. They're both sort of interested in esoteric foreign policy themes. So they're intellectual equals, actually. But Nixon is also amused by Kissinger. And there's one part that I love, which is they're talking about sort of going away for the weekend to Camp David. And they're talking, this is Nixon talking to Haldeman. They're discussing who they'll bring to Camp David with them. And at one point, Nixon says, okay, well, let's bring Henry. And then a couple of minutes later, he says, no, we won't bring Henry. He's too much of a pain in the ass. So that really kind of captures what Nixon thought of Kissinger, which is that he was certainly, useful to him, but he was also a pain in the ass.
People have always wondered about Nixon's drinking habits because he slurs his words famously on one tape that I can remember. But what did you make of Nixon's alcohol and drug intake? And
Right.
what factor was that in all of this?
Yeah, I think it's been to some extent exaggerated, although there's a basis of it. I don't think Nixon got drunk every night, but there's certain times when he did, particularly when he was under great stress. For example, when he was forced to fire Haldeman and Ehrlichman, he goes up to the room that the Lincoln sitting room, his favorite room in the White House, and he starts drinking, and his voice gradually becomes more and more slurred. He would drink to the point of passing out some nights. He had great trouble sleeping, and it was often the mixture of pills that he was taking. He was taking pills to try to get to sleep. Actually, I think you found some of the records of his doctor, and you would find that he would be taking these pills to try to get to sleep, and then he would be drinking. It didn't take him too many drinks before he started, sounding pretty drunk. So, I think he was in control of himself for the most part, but there were some days, some incidents, when he was certainly out of control, and you wouldn't have wanted him to be in charge of the nuclear arsenal. There's a famous case, well, he was in charge of the nuclear arsenal, but he had people around him who were, including Kissinger, who were making sure that he wasn't going to take rash decisions. So there are a few nights like that, but I don't think, that wasn't the sort of typical. I mean, he certainly enjoyed a drink in the evening, and he needed something to wind down, so he did drink a bit, and sometimes he drank to excess. I'm interested in your opinion about that.
Well, the pharmacology was different back in 1960s, and they did things they wouldn't do today. I mean, he had a jar with 1,000 Dilantin in it. You noted that among the side effects of this is insomnia. Here's a guy who suffers from insomnia. Right. He's taking a drug that can give him more insomnia. Right. I don't think doctors would allow that to happen today.
Yeah.
He had, here we are at the Kennedy Library. President Kennedy had Dr. Feelgood, who gave him a terrible mixture of uppers and downers, injections. And so it just wouldn't happen today. But it did happen back in the 50s and 60s. And you have to wonder whether it, didn't have some impact on their ability to function. I know I've written about Dwight Eisenhower. He got addicted to sleeping pills. And the sleeping pills were just stronger in the 1950s. They had drugs that they don't put in sleeping pills today. So it's hard to know, what the impact of these things are, but you do wonder about it a little bit.
Right. Yeah, the pills were as risky as the alcohol, probably in the case of Nixon, and the mixture of the two, the effects of the two. I'm not so sure that it wouldn't happen today. I mean, it might have happened.
Well, depending on what their doctors are like today, but they know more about pharmacology today and what the side effects are. They're not Valium, and Nixon was taking Valium, and I don't think a doctor would be handing out a lot of Valium to a president today, or at least I hope not. Let me ask you a little bit about one of the things that's poignant about this whole story is Nixon's family. He was devoted to his daughters. Certainly, his relationship with his wife is complicated to me, particularly in this period. I think early on, his marriage was pretty good. Later on, it was pretty good. I think in this particular period, well, let me ask you,
Yeah.
what do you think about his relationship with Pat, and how did it affect him during this period, and his relationship with his daughters?
Well, some of the most sort of affecting moments, in the tapes are actually his calls from his younger daughter, Julie, who must have authorized the release of these conversations because they show a different side of her father. I mean, he can be yelling at his aides, enmeshed in these political scandals or dealing with sort of world crises. And then suddenly Julie comes on the line and he switches from being the irascible president to being a loving father. I mean, and the switch is instantaneous. So I included a little bit of that. And certainly Julie, I think there are more tapes from Julie because I think she had to authorize the release of those family tapes, and Trisha didn't. There was a kind of conflict between the two daughters.
Right.
As far as his relations with Pat are concerned, I think, there were moments during this crisis where it took a lot out of the family, and he was becoming more and more distant from all of them. And, they did their best, particularly Julie, to sort of try to get through to him. But he was, part of the psychodrama that I'm looking at is the stress, not just the political crisis, but the personal psychological crisis. And he was being subject to the most, it's very difficult for us to imagine the stresses that he was undergoing at that period. And part of it, he was withdrawing to himself, and they were all finding it very difficult to get through to him. And there was one day in particular, actually, it was Easter Sunday, when he's down at Key Biscayne in Florida, and his wife is trying to get through to him, his daughters are trying to get through to him, he just will not respond. And I actually have a photograph which I've found at the Nixon Library.
Great photo.
Published in the book, where they're all going in separate directions. Pat is going in one. This is after the formal photo shoot. They just took a couple of extra photos, and you see them. They're all wrapped up in their individual worlds, and the president Nixon is off by the side, sort of looking down at the ground, and it's a portrait of a family. A family facing a crisis.
It's a very affecting photo in your book, and there are a number of them actually. Your book is well illustrated. You got a lot out of the archives of just showing these sides of Nixon. Some of it ridiculous, but some of it kind of moving. I mean, Nixon is not, in his own way, an unsympathetic character. He did a lot of unsympathetic things, very unsympathetic things. But there is a side to him that's even kind of brave. I mean, I was struck that he, in the midst of this, he could be calm. He's meeting with Teddy White, JFK's friend, and trying to win over JFK. We're trying to win over Teddy White as JFK had won over Teddy White. Not totally succeeding, but succeeding somewhat. But the point is, it's on a terrible day for him, but he's calm. What do you make of Nixon's ability to be calm in the middle of these storms sometimes?
Well, in some ways, he was at his best during crisis, and that the crises made him. I mean, after the crisis, he writes about this in his book, Six Crises. Actually, right. Crises define his personality and his rise to the presidency. And he writes that, the most agonizing moment is the moment before you make a decision, before you come to a decision. Once you're in the middle of the crisis and you've taken the decision, then it becomes easier. So he was a fighter, and he lived for these fights, and he knew how to compartmentalize. So he would focus on one thing and focus on the other. So that's very interesting to see in the middle of Watergate. And Dean has betrayed him. Other people have betrayed him, but he's sort of actually pretty focused and calm and operating in a way that, for most of us would be extremely difficult. So, I mean, although he finds a way to deal with all this, unbearable stress, And that was really his quality as a politician, plus his resilience that, they knocked him down numerous times, but he keeps on getting up. And, even after he says you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, I mean, he thinks his political career is over. He gets up again and wins the presidency. And even after Watergate, and he's forced to resign, a humiliation of leaving office in disgrace, he then sort of fights back and has a post-presidency that he writes a lot more books. And then he finally at his funeral, 4 living presidents show up for his funeral. So there's a measure of rehabilitation at the end. And I think this is testimony to, Nixon's ability to keep on remaking himself and never to completely accept defeat.
So on balance, how do you feel about Nixon?
Well, like you, I think that, if you write a book about someone, you have to put yourself in their shoes, and you may not approve of them, or you may differ with them politically, or you may be shocked by them, many of their actions and the way they express themselves. But just the exercise of being a biographer forces you to, see something through your subject's eyes. So I often say that I don't sympathize with Nixon, but I, had to empathize with him in order to write this book. And I certainly didn't want to present him as a cartoon character. I mean, I think that it's very easy to do a caricature of Nixon. And I wanted to show that there are many sides to Nixon. There's the evil, shocking side, criminal side even, and there's a more admirable side. And, this is essentially the story of a man who rose from poverty. He achieved everything that he did achieve in life through his own efforts, and then he threw it all away. And, that's, to me, the definition of tragedy.
Well, and you do it in a way that's very a show don't tell way. It's very, very effective by this compression. And I know it's your David Marin has called it your signature technique. I think revealing character through compression of time. This is a method that you have chosen consciously. All your books follow. Talk to you just for a minute. I'm going to turn to audience questions here in a second, but before we do, let's just talk for a minute about your method, how you go about this, why you've chosen this particular, it's not a device, but it's an approach to writing.
We sort of call this kind of slice of history approach. That is, I'm deliberately not trying to tell the whole story of Watergate or the whole story of Nixon's life, but I'm trying to condense it into the most, into a critical period that reveals the character of the man. And in this case, it's, just those few months after his second inaugural. Somebody actually, there's all this sort of bogus people calling themselves presidential historians. I think it's a bit of a bogus title because, presidential historians are just historians. But anyway, somebody suggested I call myself a presidential crisis historian, which is also bogus, but that's kind of the method. I focus on the crisis rather than the entire life. But actually, the tapes, I was kind of driven to this in part with Nixon because you've got this incredible resource, the tapes. But the tapes, you must have found this when you wrote your book about Nixon. And the tapes are an incredible resource, but they're a blessing and a curse because they're so rich. You can follow the man around the White House day by day, minute by minute, hour by hour. But if you're writing the traditional cradle to grave biography of Nixon, you can only use a bit of this incredible material. And I was also forced to be selective, but by narrowing the time frame, I could at least show more of the texture and draw on this amazing resource to show what it was like to be in the White House day by day as the president faced his greatest crisis. I sometimes, refer to myself as I try to, take the reader by the hand and wear flies on the wall in the Oval Office or the Lincoln Sitting Room or Camp David or wherever. Actually, I think a better analogy is a bug in the desk. Because a lot of this, we really are bugs in the desk. There were actual bugs in the desk. So we can listen into his conversations from the point of view of being inside his desk. And you hear him when he puts his feet up on the desk, when Manolo, the butler, comes in with coffee and puts the coffee cups down.
Rattles.
It's an incredibly sort of intimate view of one of our presidents. And I wanted to make the most of that, ability to capture this intimate view. I mean, I'd be interested in, how you as a more traditional biographer were able to use the tapes and the dilemma it put you in. Yeah.
Well, you get them right down to the tinkling of the glass, of the ice in the glass. And you're right, it's an abundance of riches, but for a fairly narrow, a crucial time of his life. It's what, February 71 till June 73, right? That's the period of tapes in a long life. So that's an issue. But however other people have done it, you hit on something here, and it works. So we should talk now to our audience, take some questions from the audience. So I'm gonna see if I can call these up here. Hang on one sec. It's a number of questions from the audience, and I'm just going to dial down here. Here's a question, Michael. Was what Nixon did fairly commonplace for the era, or did he just get caught because of the tapes? Was he fundamentally different than, say, LBJ, Eisenhower, JFK, etc.?
Well, he certainly thought that whatever he had done, previous presidents had done. And I think there's a grain of truth in that certainly previous presidents got away with things. I mean, Kennedy, for example, got away with all sorts of abuses. I read a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were waging a campaign of sabotage in Cuba, various assassination plots against Castro, others. And they were also, the Kennedy people were involved in dirty tricks. I think part of the problem that Nixon faced was that he no longer had J. Edgar Hoover to do his dirty work. At a certain point, Hoover decides that he's getting out of that business, and he actually refuses to allow the FBI to be used for, tracing all these, for political purposes. And
that leads to the plumbers. That's why the White House hires
one reason why Nixon sets up the plumbers. I mean, that was a big mistake, to bring those FBI investigative functions into the White House and to entrust, a gang of people who couldn't shoot straight. So there's some extent that is true. But I think then certainly the obstruction of justice, the so-called cover-up, I do think Nixon went beyond his predecessors. So I don't want to absolve the predecessors completely, but I think Nixon went beyond that, and he certainly paid, the ultimate price for that.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. Can you talk more about the connections you see between King Richard and, after all, your book is called King Richard and Richard Nixon, the Shakespearean link that your book title suggests?
Well, the title obviously alludes to, the Shakespeare plays, King Lear. Then Nixon wrote a number of plays on Richard, and there were 3 Richards actually in English medieval history. Nixon's often compared to Richard III, who was kind of scheming hunchback. And then there was Richard II, who was, I think, forced, who sort of bears some resemblance to the dark side of Nixon's nature. But actually his mother, and this is the reason, one of the reasons I called it King Richard. I mean, it's partly to alluding to Shakespearean tragedy, but also his mother, this very pious Quaker woman out in California, she christened three of her sons after the kings of England. And she christened Richard not after those later two Richards, but after the first Richard, Richard the Lionheart, who spent a lot of his life waging crusades in the Holy Land. So she had great ambitions for her sons, and two of Nixon's brothers, died of tuberculosis when Nixon was a very young man. Actually, that's a formative experience in his life. So the title is both an allusion to Shakespeare, but an allusion to the hopes of his mother, which particularly after the deaths of two of his brothers, they were all centered on Richard Nixon himself.
Audience asks, can you speak to the missing 18 minutes from the tape, the famous 18-minute gap?
I didn't investigate that myself. It's, prior to the time frame of my book. From what I've read about it, including Evan's book, other people have looked into it more deeply than I. I mean, I think there's no evidence that there's this final smoking gun in those 18 minutes. We do have Haldeman's notes of what happened in those 18 minutes. I think it was actually more of the same. I mean, they were undoubtedly talking about Watergate, probably talking about the cover-up, but there wasn't anything more, more incriminating than you find in the other tapes. I don't think there's evidence of Nixon actually ordering Watergate in those 17 minutes. And probably, well, either Nixon erased those 18 minutes himself, or his secretary, Rosemary Woods, destroyed them. One of the two, probably. But, this is at the beginning when they were trying to review the tapes. And at a certain point, they realized that it was a hopeless task. You couldn't, there was so much incriminating material on the tapes, you couldn't destroy everything. So I think there was incriminating material on those 17 or 18 minutes, but it was pretty much par for the course, no more incriminating than a lot of other things on the tapes.
Let me ask you about the audience asks about the October surprise. The question is, do the events of the 1968 presidential campaign, Nixon's collusion with the South Vietnamese to thwart LBJ's 11th hour peace talk, factor into Nixon's overreaction to the 1971 Pentagon paper leaks?
I'm not sure that was his motivation for, employing the plumbers to crack down on these leaks. I think they're two separate incidents. The 1968 incident was, he was afraid, he was not in office at that time. He was one of two candidates for the presidency, and he feared that President Johnson was, using the prospect of a peace deal with Vietnam to, rob Nixon of the presidency. So I think in both cases, he, kind of recurring theme in his political career is he thinks his enemies are out to get him, and therefore he must take, possibly ruthless, bordering on illegal action to defend his own interests. But I don't see that one led directly to the other.
I think the argument, this gets into a sort of a tangled tale, but I think the argument was when he orders a break into Brookings that summer,
right,
that what he's looking for in Brookings is not the Pentagon Papers, but it is a report into the 68 Chenault incident, his attempt to monkey wrench, as it was said, as he said, the peace talks, and that he's fearful that stuff is going to come out, and that's going to. And I think that's the link. Yeah, my own view of this is that maybe, but it's hard to know for sure.
Yeah, that's true. That actually the one break-in that we know that Nixon ordered was a break-in to the Brookings Institution in Washington, which he thought held some of these documents that might reveal, him trying to monkey wrench the peace negotiations in 1968. So, but actually, paradoxically, the one break-in that we know for sure that he ordered, because we have it on tape, he says, break in to the Brookings Institution, blast the safe. That break-in never took place. I mean, that shows how dysfunctional the whole thing was, that the break-in that Nixon ordered didn't take place, and the break-in that he didn't order, Watergate, did take place. So, they simply didn't have their act together.
I mean, there is one of the issues that comes up is, on one hand, it's the gang that couldn't shoot straight. I mean, it's just a bunch of galoots making mistakes. So they screwed up the Watergate break-in. Was a botch. They got caught, but also they weren't even looking for the right stuff. On the one hand, it's kind of comedy hour. But on the other hand, as Woodward and Bernstein like to say, it's an assault on the Constitution, a real threat to our constitutional existence. Where are you on that? On whether these are kind of minor crimes that they got caught on and then covered up, or whether they were really threatening our constitutional existence, whether Nixon was a real threat to the Constitution. Where are you on that?
Whereas Nixon himself said it wasn't the crime, it was the cover-up. And the cover-up is a fancy or a crude word for obstruction of justice. And if the president is leading an effort to obstruct justice, then the question is whether the president is above the law or not. And there's a certain point when Nixon says to David Frost, if the president authorizes something, that means it's legal. And this is the key question, but under the American Constitution, as I understand it, although you can hear my English accent, so I'm not, I come of it as somebody who's come to this country and become an American rather than born an American. But as I understand, the strength of the American system is that nobody, including a president, is above the law. And that was the key question that was at stake in Watergate. Is the president above the law? Or is he subject to the law like everybody else? And, partly Nixon's problem was that he got caught and other presidents didn't get caught. But, that's a very important principle to defend, that nobody in this country is above the law, including the president. And you have sort of a system of checks and balances with, every different branches of government, and no branch of government is all powerful. So the president cannot abrogate to himself he can't say that I am the law. And I have the right to obstruct justice. And that was the principle so I think in the end, the system worked back in 1972. I think that, and it had to work. And, but it took a long time. I mean, the investigation, we often forget that, it took from the Watergate break-in to Nixon's resignation is more than 2 years. And there were multiple investigations during that period. And it was only after the tapes came out, there was a long, struggle that went all the way up to the Supreme Court for whether this evidence would come out or not. And finally, the principle was defended that nobody is above the law. And, that is the importance of Watergate.
I mean, Nixon, the law was a little murky back in the 60s about executive power, how far the executive could go. Nixon helped make some law, actually, by pushing the boundaries. The law got a little bit more restrictive about what the executive could do because of his own crimes. But I agree, he was a threat to the system. Here's a question: if Nixon had survived Watergate, could he have prevented the downfall of South Vietnam? Would he have sent B-52s in if the North tried to invade the South, but for Watergate?
Well, that is pretty much Kissinger's argument. He says that Nixon was enfeebled by Watergate, and that he, Kissinger, left to himself would have somehow prevented the collapse of Vietnam, or that's the implication. I don't believe that, because I think that, and we've seen more recently in Afghanistan, I think the defeat in Vietnam was was in the end, it wasn't Watergate that led to defeat in Vietnam. It was America's mistakes in Vietnam and the fact that you couldn't carry the whole country with you on Vietnam. But I don't think that, I mean, say Watergate had not happened, Kissinger's argument is basically that, we could have bombed them some more. We could have sent the B-52s over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We could have, bombed them until they submitted. Well, they hadn't submitted for 15 years. So I'm not sure why they hadn't submitted with 100,000 American troops in the country. So why they would suddenly have submitted, with a few more bombs dropped on them, I don't think that's a very valid argument, very convincing argument.
What drew you to this topic? What got you to this book?
Well, I was interested I was a foreign correspondent. I covered the collapse of communism in Russia and Eastern Europe. At a certain point, as a journalist, you reach the point where you've had an interesting career and you've sort of witnessed some incredible events, but then you wonder what to do next. And actually, Robert Caro, he was a political correspondent and or political journalist. And at a certain point, he's talked about this. He realized that in order to write about politics and understand politics, he had to go beyond journalism. And that's why he started researching and writing his books about, eventually about LBJ. He thought he could understand politics better by being a historian rather than being a journalist. I mean, they say that journalism is the first rough draft of history. And I wanted to write, something a little deeper than that, perhaps the second rough draft of history. So when I came back from Moscow, I wrote a book about the collapse of communism. It was called Down with Big Brother. And I mainly wrote about Cold War themes, actually, because I'd spent such a long time in Russia. So I wrote about the collapse of communism, the peak of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the beginning of the Cold War. And then I'd written all these kind of slice of history books. So I thought that, Watergate and Nixon would be another book in that using the same methodology, essentially.
Have you seen, a lot of the audience has seen the movie Nixon. Do you think that Oliver Stone's Nixon is an accurate portrayal of Nixon? Do you remember? I don't know if you've seen the movie. You probably have.
I think I saw it many years ago, and so I haven't got it sort of fresh in my mind. I think that, often with these movies, there's a lot that there's some things they get right. And I think with that Oliver Stone movie, there are, certain aspects of Nixon's character they get right. But of course, they're irritating to historians because there are a lot that they get wrong and they play loose with the facts. And I happen to think that the facts are so interesting that they're much more interesting than anything you can invent.
Yeah.
And, personally, I wouldn't be able to invent half the stuff that in my book. So I prefer to, stick to the actual sources than inventing things.
Here's another question. Was it Nixon himself or Kissinger that initiated the opening to China? Who gets the credit for that?
I would give Nixon the credit. I think that, Kissinger certainly was very adept at depicting himself as the Metternich or the foremost diplomat of his time. And this irritated Nixon a lot. And, Nixon was certainly no slouch when it came to foreign policy. And he actually dreamed up the opening to China long before he became president. He was out in California and he used to look west across the Pacific Ocean at this, imaginary country right on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, this giant that was isolated from the rest of the world. So Nixon understood that, and he was excited by it, and he used Kissinger as his, I mean, Kissinger's strengths was in implementing the policy, but I think the policy actually, I think Nixon should be given the primary credit for the policy. If we're giving people credit, of course, 40, 50 years later, we may not think it's such a great idea that we did open China up to the rest of the world, but so history can take surprising turns. But I think that, Nixon, he read deeply. He was very extreme. I mean, he's like Kennedy in this respect, that he, certainly considered foreign policy the most important, field for a president to focus on, that he wasn't so interested in domestic policy. And, he saw himself, he was a great admirer of Churchill and de Gaulle, and he saw himself in that tradition. So I think that I would give more credit to Nixon, but what's your view on that?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Nixon deserves the credit. Kissinger was a very skilled, able, important executor of Nixon's policy, but it was Nixon's policy. What did you think about how Nixon dealt with the Watergate and the David Frost interviews?
Well, actually, that's quite a good movie, the Frost-Nixon movie. I think that it shows, Nixon, again, people have many motivations. When he gave those interviews, he was partly defending his place in history. And he was partly also trying to make some money because he was pretty much broke by the time he left the presidency. It was pretty articulate in the way he defends himself. I mean, he makes some damaging admissions. It's a very useful resource, for a biographer or historian. And to some extent, it was a feud between the two of them. But I think Nixon doesn't come off too badly in those interviews. And Frost does force him into some damaging admissions. But it's interesting. I think the movie actually captures it pretty well.
To bring this up to the present, what do you think was the people seem to are worried now about threats to democracy and so forth? Do you think the country was at greater risk in 1972 to threats to the Constitution and to democracy, or now?
I think it's in a more serious situation now. I mean, I think the system worked in 1972, and Nixon, for all his faults, did not challenge the results of an election, did not seek to overturn the results of election. Of course, his resentment at losing an election was part of the background to Watergate and his determination never to be outmaneuvered again by his political enemies or opponents. But basically, I think Nixon played by the rules. I mean, he bent the rules and certainly, tried to stack the game to his advantage. But I cannot see him doing some of the things that our most recent president has done. I mean, I think he, respected, and the way he handled the 1960 election is pretty much an example of that, and also the way he handled his own resignation. I mean, you may say, well, of course, the Republican Party has changed a lot in the last 50 years. The whole sort of bipartisan, any semblance of bipartisanship in Congress has disappeared. I mean, the idea of Nixon was finally forced out when a delegation of Republican leaders went to see him and told him that he was going to lose a impeachment vote in Congress. But essentially, the system worked back in 1972 to 1974, and Nixon accepted that. I mean, he hated it, he says that resigning was, contrary to every bone in his body, but he resigned, and there was a peaceful transition to his successor. And, that tradition was threatened in the last election. So, I think there's a big distinction between Nixon and our most recent president.
You've read a lot of history. Do you think our system is going to, let me make this the last question.
Yeah.
From your reading of history, how confident are you that our system will continue to survive?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, and I've always thought that, America has an incredible ability to renew itself and to deal with its problems. And, but I must say that I'm sort of worried. And, I saw in Eastern Europe and in Russia, a system that completely collapsed, a social order that collapsed. And I thought at the time that this is impossible, in the United States. But in fact, all political systems are transitory and not quite as strong as they may appear to be. So I think, democracy has to be defended and cherished, and it is under threat. And I don't think, I think it'd be foolish to say that the outcome is obvious. I think, various different things can happen. I can foresee different outcomes over the next couple of years. And I think we have to, one of the lessons of 1972 and Watergate is that we have to find ways to make the system work and to cherish what we have.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you, Michael, for this very interesting hour and a half. Thank you to the audience out there for the Kennedy Library. Thank you to the Kennedy Library, and good night.
Thank you very much, Evan.